Hello, people, still there, yes, good. Annette, you may come forward now. Annette's been hiding behind the curtain, okay? I just want to I want to introduce Annette very, very briefly, because you have her biog, and some of you already know her. It's a great, wonderful thing she's able to come back to Charleston in her new role. I just want to say one thing, that is, among the people running the large mega companies that control your existence, she is the person who was a researcher, is still deeply in touch with researchers. So you have somebody here who actually knows about research. This is Annette.
Thank you, Anthony. So good morning everyone. And I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this truly unique event. It's been 6 years since I last spoke, and it's a pleasure to be back, especially at such a pivotal time in our industry. Most of us here are information professionals of one kind or another. And these days, almost every large organization has an information director, a chief information officer, or some sort of head honcho for information. And they're no longer just the people running the computer network. They're helping to shape organizations and strategies in order to make the best possible use of the 21st century's most valuable asset, information. Of course, universities have always had information experts, though they're usually called librarians. Sometimes it seems as if the rest of the world has been playing catch-up with academia when it comes to appreciating the central role of information in our lives. But this isn't to say that we've all got it nailed. We still have a lot to learn about how research could work better than it does today. This is important not only for us and all of our organizations, but it's important for the whole world, because what's at stake is the future of research, and research enriches us all. It enriches us intellectually, culturally, and economically. In my talk this morning, I'd like to talk about some ways that we can make what we do better. But first, I wanted to briefly describe some of the current problems that we face in our industry. And I'm not talking about flat library budgets, important though they are. And I'm not talking about battles over copyright and technological disruptions. All of these problems are certainly important, but to consider them the most important things would be too narrow-minded. I'm talking about even bigger challenges faced by the whole research enterprise. Over the last few decades, universities have enjoyed unprecedented growth. They've risen in number from about 500 worldwide just after the Second World War to more than 10,000 today. Student numbers have increased similarly. In the UK, nearly half of all students now go on into higher education, a roughly tenfold increase since the 1960s. Around 70% of US high school students go on to college. In the developed world, university enrollment has become a rite of passage. But while universities should be basking in the glow of this remarkable success, many universities instead feel a sense of crisis. This is brought on about by three fundamental questions that are being asked more and more. Who are universities for? Should every student aspire to attend, or would eliminating elitism from higher education miss the point of it? Who should pay for universities? The current students, their parents, of which I am one, 4 children, current taxpayers, future taxpayers, past and present benefactors, or some combination of these? And above all, what are universities for? Are they for conducting taxpayer-funded research? Are they for training the next generation of professors? For teaching employable skills? For supplying medical care? For providing infrastructure for the humanities and the arts? For fielding sports teams? Or even acting as landlords and custodians of real estate? Which, if any of these roles, would be better left to others? But not all of the problems in our industry are on the educational or institutional side. Researchers also face their own set of challenges. How should research respond to political hostility? What can be done to restore the social standing of experts? How can research inform politics without descending into partisanship? And how can research funding avoid becoming a victim of political infighting? Should research serve the economy or human culture? What is the true purpose of research? And how can we measure and maximize the desired outcomes? How can we best demonstrate and communicate the benefits? And finally, why is so much research impossible to reproduce? What more can be done to counteract the inevitable biases of individual researchers? How can we reward truly robust research? And what incentives can we provide for uncovering invalid findings? These are all important topics, but let me dwell for a few minutes on the last one. The popular image of research, at least among researchers themselves, has been of a process that transcends human biases by providing a series of checks and balances through processes like peer review, editorial selection, competitive grant funding, tenure committees, and so on, that reward convincing novel findings and the researchers who produce them. To a large extent, this is true. Witness the long track record of progress over the decades and even centuries, but it is becoming increasingly clear that important aspects of the system are broken. The psychologist Brian Nosek, among others, has shown that researchers routinely fall prey to cognitive biases. Rather than reasoning based on data, they rationalize their pre-existing beliefs by selective interpretation of their results. If you believe Karl Popper, scientists are supposed to spend their days trying to prove their pet theories are wrong, and the more they fail, the stronger those theories become. But in practice, this rarely happens. And in a sense, this means that researchers are no different from the rest of us. Surely it is the scientific process itself that helps us to overcome these individual weaknesses and biases. But on the contrary, in some ways, the system that we all inhabit exacerbates them. John Ioannidis' famous or infamous paper, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, showed that, at least in biomedical research, using current approaches and statistical thresholds for significance, we should expect most research findings to be wrong. Not some or even many, but most. And this isn't unique to biomedicine or even the natural sciences. In more recent work, Ioannidis and his colleagues have reported comparable problems in economics, for example, and there's no reason to think the problem stops there. And given that everyone in this room in some way is involved in that research ecosystem, this important fact makes me at least pause. Next, I'd like to talk about the world that I inhabited for so many years, journal publishing. Why publish so much that is read by so few? The ever-increasing rates at which papers are published aren't just a sign of higher rates of discovery. They also reflect the fact that researchers and publishers alike have become hooked on a publisher-perish model that values quantity over quality. The impulse to share is good and even central to science, but the main incentive is to publish in order to satisfy funders' requirements and to extend bibliographies rather than to genuinely contribute to the pool of human knowledge. That's why we get salami slicing of research into minimal publishable units, as we used to call them, and vast numbers of papers that are referenced or even perhaps read by literally no one. Of course, distinguishing between seminal and inconsequential work was the central problem that citation analysis was invented to solve, and it will remain a vital method to achieve this, but we can and should go further, and I'll return to this point in just a moment. Why publish only positive results? In a way, this is an opposite of the first problem. Though we publish a lot, we are in some respects too selective. By publishing only positive or surprising results, we contribute to publication bias, which is one of the key reasons that the system embraces so many misleading conclusions. To give a simple illustrative example, if a given experiment has a 1 in 100 chance of giving the wrong, though interesting and surprising result, and 100 labs try it, then surely the one lab with the surprising but wrong result shouldn't be the one to publish. We're currently putting too big an emphasis on surprise and novelty when we should be rewarding other, less sexy but equally important attributes of good research. So how can we be part of the solution rather than part of the problem? And this is the key question. The research enterprise is monumentally successful human creation, and all of us involved in it can take some credit for that. But in certain important ways, it's broken, which poses a challenge for all of us, whether we're curators, disseminators, and custodians of research information. But it's an opportunity too. The coming decades could be a golden age for research, and the world has never had more talent, more knowledge, or more wealth. And yet even that can sometimes feel like a barrier. Just because technology allows us to do almost anything doesn't mean that we should try and do everything. What principles can we follow to differentiate between the good, the bad, and the utter waste of time? Obviously, I don't have all the answers, but I'd like to share some thoughts on this. Over the last 25 years, the web has transformed human society, including research, but it was also a product of research, born of the early academic internet and the foundational work of Tim Berners-Lee, then at CERN. The worlds of research and technology have always been highly connected, and the web is a wonderful example of that. It can also serve as a source of inspiration as we think about how to meet our current challenges. The explosive success of the web was in large part thanks to 3 core principles that can also guide us as we build the systems and organizations, the products and services that will support research in the 21st century. Connectedness, openness, and seamlessness. First, connectedness. In the age of data, where we currently sit, we have unparalleled opportunities to construct views, maps, and pictures of information in ways that no previous generation has enjoyed. David Warlock, who I'm sure many of you know, recently reminded me of a quote by Marvin Minsky, which is, "The surprising thing about great libraries of today is that the books are unable to speak to each other." And this serves as a reminder that in another generation, much new knowledge could be generated by machine intelligence interactions with existing pools of knowledge. It also reminds us that nothing in research stands on its own. Every paper cites its predecessors, and every researcher has collaborators. Every new discovery is connected to an array of associated facts. The genius of the web was to realize that knowledge itself is a network, and that we can represent and navigate it more effectively by creating a virtual space that mimics this. In a sense, hyperlinks existed in people's minds, but this is the first time in human history that they've been clickable. Just as Eugene Garfield realized that counting citations was a good way to measure the importance of a piece of research, Google realized that counting hyperlinks was a remarkably effective way to gauge the importance of a web page. Google's ranking algorithms now consider hundreds of factors, including the particular interests of the person doing the search, but counting links still plays a part because it fits so well with the way the web works. It was connectedness that gave rise to the Science Citation Index, to the Web of Science, and even the Journal Impact Factor. There is knowledge and understanding connectedness. The Journal Impact Factor quite rightly receives a lot of attention, both positive and negative. But when used correctly, it remains an important measure of assessment of journals because it uses connectedness in a standardized way to tell us something important about the journal and its discipline and how both are evolving. We also need to be open to a much wider range of indicators beyond citations and a wider range of contributions beyond papers. Researchers are much more than the papers they publish, and the papers they publish contain much more information and knowledge than just the citations. By looking beyond this, it will help us to create a healthier research ecosystem and reduce some of the perverse incentives that led to the kinds of biases I've recently described. It should also help to address the misuse of metrics and indicators, including the journal impact factor, because we have a wide range of indicators upon which to draw. There are many efforts underway to address this across the industry, including at Clarivate, and this is exactly the rationale behind the reestablishment of the Institute for Scientific Information earlier this year. Unlike the Google search algorithm, however, it is vital that research indicators are both transparent and easy to understand. Without this, they won't gain the necessary credibility and confidence, and they won't deserve to be widely adopted. And this relates to my next point, openness. At its foundations, the web is an open system. The underlying protocols are public goods. Anyone can connect to the internet, register a domain, and set up a website. There have always been and continue to be attempts to control and censor the online world, some of them disturbingly effective. But if we compare the world today with that of a few decades ago, it's clear that we've made huge progress, even if we sometimes take 2 steps forward only to take 1 step back. Research, too, is founded on the principle of openness, and I don't just mean open access publishing, important though that is. Openness is about transparency. It's about transparency between individuals and transparency between organizations, including service providers like Clarivate. It's about sharing your insights, showing you're working, and being willing to take blame as well as credit. It's about a generosity of spirit and a healthy degree of humility. It's about recognizing that important though our work is to each of us individually, it's really just a small contribution to a much greater collective endeavor. Above all, it's about acknowledging that research is not something that any of us does individually, but it's something that we all do together. Clarivate will play its part, especially through the newly reconstituted ISI, but I hope that ISI will contribute to all kinds of developments in research and assessment, from cataloging and curation to new kinds of indicators and incentives, and that these will foster new approaches to research without some of the shortcomings I've just described. But openness is also about being receptive to new uses of content and data. If we want researchers to publish negative results and to share experimental data while at the same time not drowning in the information deluge, then we need to do a better job in fostering technologies that can help them do this. For each human interface to our products, we should also have a computer interface, an API. And every time we think about how our articles or records might be consumed individually by human readers, we should also consider how they should be consumed in bulk by computers. Because that's the world that we live in now, and that's where so much power remains to be unlocked. And that is how research information will be used in the future. And none of this is to underestimate the value of human judgment and curation. Those skills will always be essential to our work. But by collaborating closely with computers, we'll be able to achieve so much more. To give one example that I'm familiar with, we've recently expanded the Web of Science APIs, which allow our partners to directly access new sources of data and integrate with their own information. We're only at the beginning of this journey, and there's a lot more work to be done, and there's a lot of exciting developments in this API space across the industry. But I believe that we are taking a step as a group in the right direction. It's this kind of interoperability that is the future of online applications, which is to say that it's the future of pretty much everything that we do. And this brings me to the third important characteristic of the web. Although it's decentralized, it's also remarkably seamless. Jumping from one website to another doesn't feel any different to moving between pages on the same website. Users rarely need to think about where in the world any piece of content is located. Even more impressively, the web can seamlessly blend text, images, video, data, and code into a rich interactive publications or applications of a kind that aren't possible in any other medium. We're still at the beginning of this evolution from static to interactive content, and we all have a lot to learn, but this is the future of knowledge dissemination. Inspired by the example of the web, we need to become seamless too. Of course, that means our own products and services should work well with each other, but that's not enough. We also need to achieve seamlessness between organizations. And as you all know better than I, seamlessness also applies to the library, which isn't standalone, but increasingly working in a seamless way across the institutions, often with a view to supporting communication between scholars, assessing the research and communication of research discoveries. And so the products and services that we provide need to support all of you in this broadest of remits, and they need to work in a seamless and interoperable way. One area that I and many of us are focused on are creating a seamless way for researchers to access content, using technologies to simplify the hurdles and barriers that exist to accessing journal articles. This is important because these barriers are frustrating for researchers, and they slow down progress for all of us. Our mission is to help people make sense of the vital but complex world of research, taking an unbiased and independent approach, without fear and without favor. Above all, we want to understand and support the various participants, from institutions, funders, and governments to publishers and corporations. But ultimately, and most importantly, we want to support the researchers themselves. If only the world of research looked as simple as this, it would be an easier task. But as we all know, it's nothing like this, but it's more like this. Like the web itself, research is constantly moving. It's a constantly moving maelstream of ideas, of interactions, and innovations. But also like the web, that's precisely its strength and the reason that it's so productive. So I hope I've managed to explain some of the lessons that I think we can take from the huge success of the World Wide Web. These are lessons that its creators, many of whom are researchers, often inherited from academia. The world of the web and research are not just mutually reinforcing, they're inextricably linked. So it was perhaps natural, a year on from my appointment to Clarivate, to think about how I would use these characteristics of the web, connectedness, seamlessness, and openness, to think about what we would do and how we could make our contribution. And just to give you a little bit of a preview of where we're heading, you can see that now in our name, the Web of Science Group. So this won't formally be announced until January, but for me, the Web of Science is the Web of Science in a connected, seamless, and open way. It's about bringing what we do together, but also making it interoperable and more flexible with what you're doing. But where does research go next? No one organization, let alone one individual, has all the answers. So what I've tried to cover in this talk isn't by any means a comprehensive solution. What I've tried to do is to provide some pointers, some ideas, some ways of thinking that I hope that can move us collectively in the right direction, and allow those of us that are working alongside the academic, research, and scholarly community to find our true purpose in enabling excellence going forward. To enable excellence in a way that maximizes the impact that research has on society at large. And finally, I'd like to end on a personal note. As Anthony mentioned, for many years I was a publisher, but before that I was an editor, and before that I was a researcher, a cell biologist to be exact. I'm lucky to have been able to maintain my academic ties over the years, and even most recently as a trustee at Yale. These and other interactions with universities all over the world provide me with constant reminders of how much has changed. Scientific communication is changing. We've been talking about this for decades, but I think we are truly at a pivotal point. New tools, new approaches are being explored by new players, by publishers, small and large, by librarians, funders, and organizations like the Web of Science Group involved in workflow data analytics and assessment. And yet, in the last 15 years, perhaps the most significant trend in our community has been the increasing consolidation and opportunities of scale, including so-called vertical integrations. But in my view, this is no answer to the challenges described. Arguably, it compounds the problem. And it compounds some of the challenges, as what we need most of all is not size and conformity. What we need most of all is talent. What we need is diversity of thinking and creative approaches, which are not always comfortable partners with a unified corporate view. Ours is an industry built on the vision and daring of people like Eugene Garfield. He was a true pioneer. He and his colleagues brought order to a chaotic world of research information. Now we need to rise to a similar challenge. Cynics often tell me that today's big innovation opportunities lie in a different realm, especially in technology, and we shouldn't have such high expectations for our own industry. I disagree. The domain in which we operate is still full of opportunities and good ideas if you know where to look. These can drive progress for many more decades to come. We just need to have the insight to recognize them, the courage to act, and the integrity to place the needs of researchers and scholars at the heart of what we do. If we can do this, then the rest will take care of itself. Thank you.
You stay there. That was fantastic, Annette. You're willing to answer some questions, I know. Now, people who want to ask questions, please come down to the microphones here or here. And there's the same sort of position upstairs, there and there, and there and there, and maybe even there and there, but we can't see them because they're people of the darkness. So while people...
I think there's only one person up there.
There's only one person up there. So while people are coming forward to ask a question, I'm going to ask a question, and that is, you mentioned the proper use of the journal impact factor, but as you know, it is improperly used a lot in terms of judging people just on the impact factor of their publications. What can anybody do about this?
Thanks, Anthony. A question I often get. I think that the journal impact factor has stood the test of time because it has been consistent and quite standardized. We know what it's measuring, by and large. Just this past year, we made some more important, and I would say overdue changes to the journal impact factor, if you haven't seen them, where you can now directly query the data in both the numerator and the denominator. And that allows some really important trends and information to be revealed that was more difficult to do previously. I think that's one step to helping make sure that the journal impact factor is used in the right way, is making it more transparent. It needed that transparency. It's an important step forward. But I think beyond that, there's also more that we can and should do. One of the driving factors behind the establishment of, or the reestablishment, I should say, of the Institute for Scientific Information, which we announced in February, is to help with the communication and I would say knowledge exchange around how to use and to not use metrics and indicators in general, but the journal impact factor in particular. This is important because ISI is a part of our group that operates as an academic think tank, if you will. It's not directly involved in the rest of the business. It's really there to drive from an editorial, but also from a metrics and indicator perspective, a completely independent approach. So that's one way that we are investing and actually creating the ability and the means to support the use of metrics and indicators, including the journal impact factor, in the right way. But I think there's also a lot more that the community at large can do, which is to stop using journal impact factors in a different way, in the wrong way. And then I would say beyond that, there's a lot more that we and others can begin to measure and understand beyond the citations, which I mentioned in the talk just now. And we are very busily working on that, and you'll see more from us in that in the coming months.
Notice this statement, people. Write it up.
Yeah. So we need to move beyond citations, but we need to make sure that the metrics and indicators that we use are used in the right way.
Thank you very much. There's the lady down here, and she's going to give us her name and affiliation, and then she's going to ask a stunning question.
Oh, all right. Yep. Hopefully one of many. Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful presentation. My name is Nancy Herther. I'm with the University of Minnesota. And I want to go back a little bit. Your speech certainly brought me back to Jean Garfield, who I guess I knew since the late 1970s. When you were talking about getting into the mind of the researchers and being able to really use that as sort of a central focus, that inspiration of what it is that moves people forward. Can you talk a little bit about how the ISI that is sort of being rebooted here, or not really rebooted, but renamed, reconceptualized? Can you give us more information on that?
About ISI. ISI really has two areas that it's focused on. The first is editorial. And by editorial, I mean looking at how we curate content, which content is curated, and the process that is used to select and deselect content that's included in the first instance in the Web of Science. This was really the heart of the Web of Science. This is where it all began. I was attending a meeting recently of some very senior publishing executives, and one of them said, "Oh, why don't you just put all of the journals in the Web of Science? Why do you select them?" And I said, "Well, why don't you just publish everything? Why do you peer review?" I think for me, curation is a really critical part of what Dr. Garfield set up originally with ISI, and it's a really important part of what we do today. I think there's ways that we can improve what we do, and you'll see that also coming in the next weeks and months. Around the transparency of that process, around the speed of that process, and being really clear about what is a quality indicator versus what is an impact indicator, and using that in the indices that we produce. Because, as I said, you can do anything, but you don't necessarily need to do everything, and I think that curation is really important. So one area that ISI is focused on is really revitalizing the editorial curation process. And you see we've appointed an editor-in-chief, which that role hasn't existed in our organization for years and years and years. There's been an editorial team, but not an editorial chief. An editor-in-chief for me has a particular role, and an editor-in-chief also signifies that there's a voice. And ISI, you will begin to see will have a voice. And by that I mean we have access to a lot of data, and we have access to a lot of information. Over the last decade or so, I would say that the organization lost its voice, and it allowed others to talk about the data, which is fine, but it didn't have a lot to say about its own data and what they felt that meant. So ISI will be reestablishing an editorial voice through series of white papers, events, et cetera, to really bring together experts and interested parties from around the community to really discuss and debate not just the data itself, but the implications of what we're learning from that. So expect more of a voice. And then finally, new metrics and indicators is an area that ISI is very much focused on, looking at areas like social impact or economic impact, a much broader palette of ways of looking at the impact of research in its totality. And then finally, I must mention that it's about quality of data. So ISI is our in-house data quality checker. They're responsible for ensuring the highest standards of the data and content that we have. And again, that's why it's very important that ISI operates in an unbiased way, without fear and without favor. And that's also why it's very important, in my view, that the organization that I now run is not a journal publisher, because we need to be able to look at the data and the content in a completely neutral and objective way. And that's what ISI is set up to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm looking around. I can't see anybody upstairs, but because I can't see you. But if you're there, could you squeak? But no. I'm going to ask a question which a lot of librarians will not ask because they feel it would be unfair, but I think I can do that. It's a question of should something as important as ISI be in the hands of a commercial company? And I'm sure you can answer this one, but it is a question I know lots of librarians worry about.
Thank you, Anthony. You always give me the good ones. I think that there's a lot of different types of organizations in our research community. Some are commercial, some are not-for-profit, some are run by government bodies, and we all have a role to play in making research work better. I believe, and obviously this also speaks to my background as being CEO of Nature and Macmillan for so many years, I believe that a commercial approach can add a lot of value if used in the right way. And what do I mean by that? I think, first of all, really understanding why you're there and what you do, and reflecting that and have it being reflected in your brand is really important. The reason that we've chose Web of Science Group as our new name is because it is about the web and being seamless and connected and open, but it's also because the Web of Science takes us back to the early days of Eugene Garfield. And what he stood for and what ISI stood for and stands for today is integrity, collaboration, and innovation. And if you can tackle the problems that we're trying to tackle with that in mind and take a long-term view, I don't believe that ensuring that there is enough of a commercial benefit at the end of the day to reinvest in what we're doing is a bad thing at all. I alluded a little bit to the fact of some of the challenges that we see when things go wrong, at least in my perspective, has had to do in the last decade or so with scale. There's been this relentless focus on scale, as if bigger is better. Someone I spoke to yesterday was lamenting the big deal. They said, well, it's certainly big, but I'm not sure it's been much of a deal. Yeah, so I think this issue of size sometimes clouds where it is we think we need to go, and it doesn't often allow us to tap into the diversity of thought that we need. So I think, Anthony, that is it best that ISI is in the hands of a commercial organization? I would say yes, provided that we take a long-term view on what we're trying to achieve, that we keep the interests of the researcher and the research community really at the heart of what we do, that we don't focus on scale, but we focus on quality, and that we collaborate and that we innovate and that we operate with integrity, then I think that there's a lot that we can do in partnership with the rest of the community.
I think that is a very interesting answer, and I think also Annette has characteristically managed to finish at exactly the right time, and I want to, on behalf of you all, I want to thank her so much for sharing so much with us and making sure that we will be watching her press announcements for the next year or so very closely and with a lot of interest. So thank you so much.